I would say the same is true on Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese haven't evicted any Philippine forces from the feature, closed off access. The Chinese term active defence here. In the South China Sea, it has come to mean waiting for a pretext to take offensive action. As I heard Major General Chen Zhou explain last year, win by striking only after the enemy has struck. Final slide, please, the one that says UNCLOS solution. But by sticking to its U-shaped line claim, despite the case being brought by the Philippines at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, China is heading for direct conflict with the current norms of international law. It's not hard to see why it rejects a solution based upon UNCLOS. It would lose any hope of access to wide areas of sea. China would prefer an imaginative interpretation of customary international law that would recognise an historic claim to all waters inside the U-shaped line. It seems Beijing no longer regards UNCLOS as a neutral arbiter of disputes, but rather as a partisan weapon being wielded to sever China from its historic rights. Some Western analysts have told me they believe the U-shaped line is just an opening gambit from which Beijing will negotiate a compromise. I think they're wrong. It is the destination towards which China is inexorably heading. That's the end of my paper. That's the end.
Council General. No, he's back up.
He's finished.
Finished. Well, thank you very much. We're really pleased to have the Consul General, Japanese Consul General, here in Boston with us. He's having a dinner at his house tonight. Swan and I and Kitty are going to be there, so we're going to let him go a little earlier so we can prepare for all of this. So, Consul General, come and join us.
Yeah, you can podium.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, everybody. Well, I did not review anything as an expert and elaborate as the two previous presenters have done. Only reason I'm speaking here is because I'm the host for the dinner, and unless I go there, there is no food. But I can assure I'm not cooking, so food will be delicious. But seriously, this issue, South China Sea, in itself is an example of a serious magnitude, but also this is an example of many other issues, particularly from our perspectives. Its relevance or the challenge to the international law is crucial. If we let something happen by default, if somebody can do a fait accompli without challenges of international law and international community, this is setting a very dangerous precedent. We already have other very serious examples in other parts of the world. So we, including our Prime Minister and our government, are very much in support of all of us working together, impress upon the importance of treating this issue, UNCLOS and other international law bases. This is, some people say, is a weak argument, because we cannot force one party to go along that way, but we hope we will mount more of collaboration so that we will be effective on that. And for that to happen, we need to see collaborators within China. We hope that the people in China would realize there are better way of dealing with their desires, including favorable international environment, resources issues. So not only to be fair on us, on the issues which is in contradiction of international law, but we will be, for Japan included, we are reaching out anybody who is willing to, for the dialogue, find the solutions. Finally, it is critical without mentioning it, that where U.S. stands on this issue. For Japan, we are particularly blessed by the very clear, strong commitment from the United States in regard to East China Sea. And the American president, the President Obama's clear commitment really changed the environment. So I can safely say where the U.S. stands on South China Sea remains and will be very, very paramountly important. Thank you for giving me this chance to share our thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. See you soon. Thanks, Mr. Jimeno, very much, and we look forward to seeing you later on this evening. We're now going to turn to Bonnie Glaser, who has participated in some of our sessions, and I think many of you know her and know of her work. She's the Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I think we're ready to listen to her now. Welcome.
Good evening, Governor. Thank you so much for having me. I regret that I'm not able to be there with you in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to join the conversation. I wonder if my slides are set up.
Yes.
Okay.
So give me a second. We'll get the slide.
So I don't have very many slides, but I think when we talk about what's going on in the South China Sea, it's really always useful to have some visuals. As many of you know, we've been running a project here at CSIS called the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, and we've been partnering with Digital Globe to obtain satellite imagery and try and track some of the dredging and construction that has been taking place in Spratly Islands. So I don't know if my slides are up, but the first, yeah? Okay, so we'll skip the slides. Okay, so what you can imagine is 5 slides that are fading, showing you what it looked like as a very pristine, small land feature at Fiery Cross, and then gradually over a 1.5 year period evolving to what we have today on Fiery Cross, which of course is 3,000 acres altogether in the Spratlys, but this particular island has the most buildup we've seen anywhere. Lots of things like cement factories, potentially what looked like radars. When I was on a panel with Admiral Harry Harris at the Aspen Security Forum in July, he said that he has seen hangars there for tactical aircraft. They have better resolution than we get. We haven't been able to see that yet. There's a very long runway. We now see that there are runways that are being built on Subi and Mischief Reefs as well. So there's... Yes? Oh, okay. Okay, so what you can do is just go through the first series of, if you go to the next, I guess, yeah, and if you click on that slide several times, it should, if it's working properly. I'm not very technically inclined, but you can see that it will roll through and show. I'm getting feedback on my ear, guys.
Yes, it went through.
Is there any way to eliminate that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, because I'm hearing myself talk.
You can see the slide.
Okay, but I can see the slides, but I'm also hearing myself talk, and it's a little bit disconcerting. I don't know if you can get rid of that. Maybe not. Okay. Okay, I think it stopped. So let me just go on and say, of course, the United States has proposed that there is a halt to land reclamation, construction, and militarization. And the Chinese have repeatedly said what they are doing is legal, justifiable, and reasonable. David Sanger talked a little bit about Xi Jinping's visit and conversations with President Obama. I understand there was no progress made on this issue. Xi Jinping at the press conference did say that China is committed to maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, managing differences and disputes through dialogue, upholding freedom of navigation and overflight, and exploring ways to achieve mutual benefit through cooperation. And then, he quite surprisingly, I think to everybody, said China does not intend to pursue militarization. This was not said privately in the discussions with the president, as I understand it, either in the Oval Office or at Blair House. But Xi Jinping provided no definition for the term militarization. And I suspect that the United States and China really do have different understandings. But I do think that Xi Jinping's statement provides a possible opening to explore ways to lower tensions through possible limits on the use of land features by all the claimants. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. A few other just recent developments that I think are worth highlighting. Often below the radar screen, there are constant episodes of bullying and intimidation by China in various waters in the South China Sea. And indeed, just 2 weeks ago, a Chinese vessel rammed and sank a Vietnamese fishing boat. And reports that I've read in the Vietnamese press claim that the Chinese crew were using knives, threatening 6 Vietnamese fishermen, and seized a very large 2-ton catch of fish. So these kinds of things are going on all the time as well. So if you go on to the next slide, which says, why should we care? For those of you who pay attention to this issue, of course, this is not new information. 8 of the world's 10 busiest container ports are in the Asia-Pacific region, and 5.3 trillion of trade, which is 30% of the world's maritime trade, goes through the South China Sea annually. And then if you scroll to the next slide, I think there's a slide on the major trade routes, just to show you how important the South China Sea is in the very major trade routes that come from Africa through the Strait of Malacca and Lombok, and all the way through up to Japan, Korea, and of course to China. And then there's a slide on the LNG flows and some of the pathways that they take, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So ambiguity remains essentially, I believe, a major source of instability in the South China Sea. And I think a big question that I have and many people still have is, what is China's desired end state in the South China Sea? And we really don't know the answer to this. Does Beijing seek to just strengthen its bargaining position for an eventual negotiated outcome in which China accepts the presence of all the claimants on the land features they now occupy, and accepts all the provisions of UNCLOS, maybe drops any historic rights over waters in the South China Sea, accepts rules within a code of conduct, and agrees to share the South China Sea and its resources. That's one possible scenario. As Bill Hayden was talking about, China's perspective on this is very different. They see themselves as catching up after lagging behind Vietnam and Malaysia and even Taiwan and the Philippines in the Spratlys. And so they clearly want to improve their situation and change the status quo in their favor. And maybe at some point they might want to strike a deal. Of course, another scenario is that the Chinese ultimately really seek complete control over the sea and the airspace in the South China Sea, and maybe have the ambition to eventually control all the land features as well. And I don't rule this out either. I think we don't know, and China remains deliberately ambiguous about both its claims and its objectives. So right after Xi Jinping was in Washington, there was a group of PLA scholars from various institutions in the PLA in Washington, D.C. And there were some interesting things that were voiced in this meeting that I participated in. Some of them suggested, and I've heard this from in fact, Chinese lawyers as well, that China plans to draw straight archipelagic baselines in the Spratlys, which is what they've done in the parrot cells. This is a violation of UNCLOS. But this, I think, would be quite worrisome and really destabilizing if they move in this direction. Other PLA officers suggested that to defend Chinese interests in these waters, it's not enough to simply have, let's say, gun emplacements or short-range artillery to protect specific land features, but that China must have a force projection capability in the South China Sea. So this goes back to this question of what did Xi Jinping mean by when he said, 无意军事化. Those of you who speak Chinese, we have no intention to militarize. So although China's objectives are not known, its actions, I think, for the past several years have been quite worrisome. There has been, as I said, periodic bullying and intimidation tactics to pressure smaller neighbors to accommodate to Chinese interests. And these steps, I think, are incrementally aimed at changing the status quo. Many people refer to this as, salami slicing, while carefully not provoking any real pushback from the United States. And the seizure of Scarborough Shoal, I think, in 2012, and China's land reclamation provide just two examples. I think it's impossible to roll back China's gains. And I think demilitarization of the South China Sea is not achievable. But the question is what is achievable, and so I'd like to maybe be a little bit more constructive in that regard. I think there may be potential to cap militarization. So the claimants could agree, for example, on weapon systems and capabilities that would not be deployed on land features in the South China Sea. So for example, surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, which I think would be particularly destabilizing. There might be an attempt to define what could be defensive versus offensive capabilities and try to forego acquisition of offensive capabilities if a definition could be agreed upon. And so in that regard, I think that Xi Jinping raising this idea of non-militarization of these features at least is an opportunity. Up until now, I think there really has been just no way forward potentially at all, other than trying to encourage everybody to sign a code of conduct. So I think that the U.S., along with Vietnam and other countries, should take the initiative to promote a common understanding of what might be defined as no militarization, and to try to influence China's approach to implementing this commitment made by Xi Jinping. So then I wanted to pick up on what David Sanger talked about with the pending freedom of navigation operations FONOPS by the U.S. And it has been reported that the U.S. is on the verge of conducting what should have been done quietly with no fanfare a long time ago, a mere incursion into 12 nautical miles around a previously submerged feature, low tide elevation that is now a bigger artificial island. So Subi Reef and Mischief Reefs, I think, are the likely candidates here. This doesn't signal a change in U.S. neutral position on the sovereignty issue. The U.S. is simply asserting its territorial rights of transit under international legal norms. And as I'm sure most of you know, the U.S. has a long-standing FONOP program that challenges excessive maritime claims by sailing and flying through international waters and airspace. The list of countries that the U.S. conducts FONOPs against last year, for example, in 2014, included some of our allies, the Philippines and South Korea, as well as our security partners, Taiwan and Vietnam. So this is not something that is intended to be an aggressive action. Unfortunately, it has been misreported by media everywhere as challenging China's sovereignty. And now the Chinese, of course, have distorted it as well as being a very provocative action. So China, of course, has repeatedly warned U.S. ships and aircrafts, first to stay out of an undefined military alert zone around its artificial islands. And according to UNCLOS, formerly submerged reefs can only have a maximum of a 500-meter safety zone. So nobody knows what the Chinese mean by this military alert zone. These FARNOPs, if they actually take place, which I assume they will be the first time that the U.S. is conducting such an operation inside the 12 nautical miles of an artificial island that was previously a submerged feature. But the U.S. has been conducting FARNOPs in the Paracels and Spratlys in recent years. So it's not as if the U.S. has not been conducting operations there. So these, in my view, will signal China that the U.S. has the resolve to enforce international law. Conducting such patrols are only one tool in the U.S. toolbox, however, and they have to be part of a larger strategy to persuade China to refrain from destabilizing actions and to rely instead on diplomacy to manage and address its territorial disputes with its neighbors. So far, I think Beijing sees the costs of continuing its destabilizing behavior as very low compared to the benefits that it is getting. So changing China's calculus really requires a more effective strategy. In my view, the U.S. cannot do this alone. The other claimants, along with neighbors who have interests in the South China Sea, should work together to shape Chinese decision-making. So, for example, willing members of ASEAN should draft a code of conduct and work to convince other members to sign it. And even if unsuccessful, the process would put pressure on China to engage more seriously in COC negotiations. I think the Philippines needs to move to implement the EDCO, or Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, so that U.S. troops can have access to local military bases. I think that's an important part of this strategy as well. And I personally would like to see Australia and Japan conducting FARNOPs in the South China Sea as well, although not necessarily jointly with the United States, but unilaterally. If the arbitral tribunal that is considering the Philippines case finds jurisdiction on at least one of the arguments put forward by Manila, then I think like-minded countries really need to step up efforts to create some positive outcomes, including consequences if China ignores an eventual ruling against it. Now, the South China Sea, of course, is not inherently a U.S.-China issue, which is one of the reasons why other countries really need to step up here. But it does involve U.S. interests as well as international laws and norms. And the U.S. seeks to ensure that China rises peacefully and in a way that strengthens rather than undermines the prevailing international system. The South China Sea, in my view, it's a test case, and it's seen as such by many nations inside and outside the region. So Chinese actions in the South China Sea are challenging U.S. interests in regional peace and stability in several different ways. They pose a challenge to international law. They pose a potential threat to U.S. military access and maneuverability in those waters in a crisis. They pose a test to U.S. credibility as a key provider of peace and security in the region. And for all these reasons, it is essential that a more effective multilateral strategy be developed to impose costs and to deter further destabilizing Chinese behavior, as well as provide reassurance to allies and friends in the region. The goal of such a strategy, let me say in closing, should be to persuade, again, I want to emphasize, persuade Beijing to use diplomatic means to manage its territorial disputes. Chinese officials and scholars often remind me, and others, that their country successfully resolved a number of territorial disputes around their land borders in past decades. And that is certainly true, and they did so peacefully. But people who raise this fail to mention that Beijing's principle for addressing disputes back then with their neighbors was in Chinese, hu yang hu rang, which means mutual understanding and mutual accommodation or compromise. China should be encouraged, in my view, to return to this principle in handling the disputes in the South China Sea. Thank you very much.
Bonnie, you still there?
I am.
I assume there were conversations about this when the two presidents got together. And apart from simply saying that they weren't interested in militarization, was there any kind of response to this? I mean, did they say anything about the fact that we're going to have ships floating around inside the zone? What have they said about that, if anything?
I do not know. I was obviously not in the room, but the way this was characterized to me is that on this particular issue, there was pretty much an exchange of talking points. That what Xi Jinping wrote in the Wall Street Journal interview, what he said in Seattle was essentially what he said to the president privately, that China has long considered the land features in the South China Sea as Chinese territory, and that China is going to solve its differences peacefully. Whether President Obama actually told the Chinese that we're going to conduct these operations, I don't know. But frankly, that would be inconsistent with U.S. practice in the past. The U.S. doesn't announce or convey to countries when we conduct these operations. In fact, it's truly bizarre that ever since this was leaked to the Wall Street Journal in May, it has been such an open discussion going on that it's just inconsistent with what is usually considered to be a simple operation. It's not intended to be a military provocation of any kind. And if the Chinese, this is just my view, if the Chinese were to interfere in this operation in the way that I think it was David Sanger who said that they might send their ships or aircraft to try to push the U.S. out, that would suggest that the Chinese are actually asserting a claim of a 12 nautical mile territorial sea around a low tide elevation, which they are not entitled to under UNCLOS. So in my view, the Chinese are very smart if they don't do anything.
Strange way for two great countries to do business. Maybe I have a different view of how you try to discuss these things. Anyway, thank you very much. Great analysis of this. Okay, we're going to turn to Professor Heidarian.
Yes.
Now, is he in the Philippines?
Yes.
He's in the Philippines. Professor, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, but I'm here in Seoul, Korea.
Oh,
Yes. Conference.
okay. Welcome to our forum and welcome to the discussion. Go ahead.
My pleasure, Governor. Right. I'll keep it very, very short and sweet, given the time constraints involved. Thank you very much again, Governor, for the invitation. First of all, let me say that in the Philippines and ASEAN, I think many countries, particularly Philippines and Vietnam, I think we're glad that President Obama at least mentioned the South China Sea dispute